One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. From keeping dozens of journals and writing poetry to photojournalism and fine art, pioneer Latter-day Saint women found ways to remember and record the events, feelings, and testimonies of their often difficult lives. And here to discuss the specifics of four of these significant individuals is Christine Cox. As Director of Library Services for the Church History Department, Christine has had a chance to explore many of the collection's greatest treasures, including, I'm sure, many of the records we'll talk about today. Christine, welcome to Legacy.
Thank you.
Would you please take a moment and just tell our listeners about yourself?
I have been working with the Church History Department now for 37 years, and so I've had a lot of opportunities to see some of the great writers and some of our great scholars and people coming in to do research. And during that time, I have been the director since 1993 over what was the library, and now it's Library Services, which entails the interaction with the public. We have public programming, we have lecture series, which is one of the things we'll be doing. We do every month, and then we have research and consultation services available for people coming in to do their own research or research information about the church.
And as I understand it, you are a very public library. You want people to come in as much as possible.
We do, and for years people have thought we're quite closed because we were hidden away in the east wing of the church office building. But we are open to the public. And we also, another misnomer is people think we are an extension of the Family History Library. We're two different libraries, and I think that people often get confused. But we do support family history researchers. About 40% of the people that come in are family history researchers. They get their vital information over at the Family History Library. Then they come to us to get more of the stories and learn more about, especially if they have pioneer ancestry.
So the Church History Library is directly north of the Relief Society building.
Correct.
And the Family History Library is just west of Temple Square.
West of Temple Square,
that's
right.
The difference.
So there are two different libraries.
Very good. You have a presentation you've entitled Remembering and Recording, which includes some wonderful graphics and pictures of the subject matter. But today, of course, we're on the radio, and we'll try to make it as descriptive a conversation as possible. We'll also try to talk our producer, Matt, into putting some of the images online.
Great.
So you say you've worked for the Church History Department for many years. Why did you choose these particular individuals for this presentation?
Well, actually, I was asked to present last year at the Women's Conference, and the theme of that particular session was, "We doubt not the Lord nor his goodness. We've proved him in days that are past," with a subtitle of Recording and Remembering. So they wanted a presentation that talked about how recording and remembering blesses our lives and strengthens us and our gratitude towards our Father in heaven. So that was, I thought, how do I take that and put that in, package it so that it was very informative, and yet we could tell the stories of some of these wonderful Latter-day Saint women. So that's where it all started. And as I was researching some of this, I had lots of women, and I just started narrowing it down, and I was looking for specifically how people recorded their history, realizing, and one of the messages I wanted to share was there's not just one way to record. It's not just all about keeping a journal. A journal is important, and it is one way of recording, but there's so many ways that we can capture history, and people have different talents and interests in different areas. So as we go forward and record history, we learn a lot through different methods.
So you quote Elder Marlon K. Jensen, and he suggests that remembering is not a passive activity. like, if you think of remembering something, it's just a mental thing. But you say, and he suggests that it's much, much more than that.
It is. I think it's a very, very active thing. As I just go forward in my own life, and as I hear about different things people are doing, we've got digital photography now, we've got scrapbooking, we've got all kinds of medium out there that can help us remember. And as I just sit down and look at photographs of my life and remember the fun things that I've done with my family, and we laugh and we share good experiences, and it builds and uplifts and bonds families and unites them together. And so I really think there's not just one way. Some people are visual learners. Some people love to read and get into, we even think of Eliza R. Snow and all the poetry she wrote. So there's so many different ways to remember. And I think that's the key that Elder Johnson is talking about, is it is an active thing, and we need to remember lots of different things. And what does that word remember really mean? You mentioned that in putting this together, you found various different lessons that there are to be learned. And a theme that you use throughout the presentation is that of angels blessing the lives of these women, and that they themselves, in turn, become ministering angels to others, basically. Can you tell me a little bit more about that theme? Yes. Part of what in the paragraph that I was given to do the presentation, there's the sentence that says, Heavenly Father has provided miracles and sent angels to care for his saints across every dispensation. When we look for and record the miracles in our lives, we can later draw strength by remembering that Heavenly Father never forsakes us. And then they have a great quote by Jeffrey Holland. How can recording our blessings increase in strength and gratitude, our strength and gratitude? So I think often, and then also Joseph Smith talked about, if women will live up to their expectations, the angels cannot be restrained from accompanying them or being with them. And so that theme really resonated, because I think we don't often think that we do have that capability of having angels help us through our trials. And I really think that there are angels among us that help us through these everyday trials. They can be our neighbors. They could be family members. They could be friends. They can be all kinds of people. And we don't often recognize the help that we receive, and that sometimes they're there for a reason. Very good. So remembering these two things that we talked about, that remembering is not a passive activity, and that through these things we can be ministered to and minister to others. Let's talk about these four women in your presentation. You started out with Emmeline B. Wells. Right. A fine choice. Emmeline B. Wells. And most people have at least heard of her. And she was born in Massachusetts in about 1828. And she began life in very humble circumstances, but she was able to go to school and receive a good education. And some women in that time period didn't have that opportunity, but she was able to. So she went to a girls' school, and she married and had a child. And one of the things about Emmeline is, I think a lot of women could, when they learn about what her history entails, can relate to at least one of her trials in life. I saw so many, as I was reading about her life, so many women that I know came to mind, because she was married very young, and her parents basically selected her husband. And so these two young 15, 16-year-old kids get married, and she has a child that dies. And I think how often everyday women, go through that kind of an experience, and how heart-wrenching it really is. And then her husband goes away to find employment and never comes back. So there she is, alone, a young girl, alone, and has her child has just passed away. And I just imagining the grief that she was going through. And I think of women today everywhere these happen often, but we don't stop and think about what do we do about those and how do we get through those difficult times. So then she went on and she marries again, and she's a polygamist wife, and then he passes away, so now she's a widow again. So she's been widowed twice by the age of 22. So here she is a widow, here she is no husband, here she is losing a child, and then she marries again to a great church leader. So then I think of bishops' wives and stake presidents' wives, a lot of those women who are in that situation where their husband's in a church calling and is gone a lot, and so she's there raising her children. So I think a lot of things went through my mind as I was researching and writing about Emmeline in this presentation, about the trials that she went through and what did she do, because she recorded them. And she went on to become a great civic leader. She taught school. She was a writer. She went out for women's rights, and she, a Relief Society president, General Relief Society president. So she did a lot of things, but all along the journey, she had to conquer all these trials that kept popping up. But she was a determined woman, and that's what I think. She has great strength in overcoming. But often she would write, and one of my favorite things that she recorded is, well, here's one. I was very low-spirited indeed. Every time anyone spoke to me, I was crying. So it talks about she pours her heart out in her journals. And I thought, this is so typical. We all go through this, men, women. We have these kinds of things happen. And I long to see my husband who is dead. Why can we not call them to us in our grief and sorrow? Why cannot our dead come back to us, if only for one sweet hour? So she really pours her heart out through her writings. Very, very good writer. And she writes for the Women's Exponent and some other things. So she's an amazing woman that I think we can learn a lot from as she recorded these things. And I think, how do we record those things from our perspective so that we can go back and gain strength from them?
So her mode of remembering and recording was journals.
Exactly.
How many did she keep?
Well, she recorded through journals, and the other areas, Women's Exponent. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Women's Exponent. It was poetry and essays that women could publish in. And so she published lots of essays, poetries, thoughts, and feelings. So it wasn't just in her journal. It was also through the printed word and the media. So there was a printed record of what her thoughts and feelings were. And she and especially she did a lot on women's suffrage. She published a lot in the Women's Exponent. It's fun to read some of her articles in the Women's Exponent about women's rights and women's suffrage and the women's politics. And she even went before Congress and the president to represent women's status, defending women's rights. And so she received a Doctor of Literature from BYU. She was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate. So it wasn't just the journals. Journals is one way, but also her other writings is another way of recording.
So who would have been the ministering angel in her life?
I think she had women around her. She talks about people like Eliza R. Snow and some of the other great women that were going through some of the same challenges, buoying her up and helping her and inspiring her to keep going. But she did have this drive to keep going. She was a very, very motivated. In fact, some people describe her, the dominant characteristic of Mrs. Wells' life was her supreme will. And I thought that was written in her obituary. Actually, it was it was a little biographical sketch about her. And but it said she turned the current of that forceful will into the peaceful channels of the gospel of Jesus Christ, made for righteous and the upbuilding of many good causes. she was invincible loyalty to the priesthood and to its requirements. So I think she had the support of priesthood brethren and other women around her that led to some of her being her angels. Eliza once told Emmeline that she would live to do a work that has never been done by any women since creation. So I think there are angels like that all along her way. And if we pay attention in our lives, I think we will find that there are women around us and men that just sometimes a small saying. And I've met a total stranger on a bus when I was despondent once, and they made some little statement, and I've never forgotten it, and it just buoyed me up and made me, I refer to that often, and I wrote that down once in my journal.
And you say, in closing, on your presentation with Emmeline B. Wells, her contributions to women are many in number, and she's honored to this day with a bust placed in the Utah State Capitol Rotunda, which has had this inscription, "A fine soul who served us."
Right. I went up and looked at that bust because I didn't know it was there until I did this presentation. And it's really inspirational to realize she made major contributions, and I don't know that a lot of people even know that.
Let's move on to Maud May Babcock, another person perhaps some people have heard of, but not everybody.
Okay. I'm sure people have heard of the Babcock Theater, that people here in Salt Lake City have heard of that. But she was born in New York, and she came from a well-refined and educated culture family. They were not members of the church, and she was taught in some of the best schools all around, from New York, Chicago, London, Paris, graduated with honors. And she had an angel come into her life. Susie Young Gates was one of her students. And Susie Young Gates convinced Maud to come to Utah to teach speech and drama. So Maud at first thought, do I really want to do that? But then she finally accepted and came to Utah as a non-member in the early years, and started to teach. And as a woman at the University of Utah, teaching in the early years, that's quite a challenge. She wasn't accepted real well by some of the peers. Sometimes she was excluded from some of the faculty meetings even. But she had a quest. She loved drama. She loved the arts. Her parents were not exactly happy that she came to this community of Mormons.
And to make it worse.
So her mother basically said, there isn't any disgrace you have brought upon the family that could equal this.
And that disgrace was when she joined the church.
Yes. She was shocked because Maud did come to Salt Lake. She wasn't a member initially, but she ended up joining the church after she did stay here, and she had quite an influence. And she just had some great pipe dreams of having a big stage and having all these plays, and she was just absolutely loved the theater and the arts. And apparently her classroom and her rehearsals, she was ruthless. I mean, she was so passionate. She wanted to make sure everything was right. But they called her Miss B, but there was Utah Governor Herbert Ma came. Apparently he was quite a shy person, and he took one of her classes. And because of that, he credits her with encouraging him to find the confidence to be in public and to be able to speak in public. So she immediately put him, when she found out how shy he was, she cast him as a role of Theseus the king in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So I can imagine a shy child or young man being cast in as a lead role that would conquer some shyness.
And having to step up.
Mm-hmm, having to step up. So she's basically credited with being the first lady of theater and drama in the state of Utah. She did lots of other amazing things, too. She became the president of the Utah School of the Deaf and Blind and published some books, and was a chaplain on the state senate. and served on the general board of the Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association, and was also an advocate for women's rights and education.
So her mode of recording would have been, what would you say?
I would say it's through her plays and her drama, as well as some of the books that she published. But she actually wrote and directed the plays. And a lot of the plays have, they're great historical records of how our culture, our life and culture, and the times in which she lived.
Let's move on to Ellen Johanna Larson Smith. Is that how you say it correctly? From all the, shall we say, regular Latter-day Saint women you could have chosen from, why this person?
This person, because we have recently discovered some of her photographs in our collection. And it's very, very inspiring when I learned about her. The photographs are just delightful, and as I do this presentation, I show many of her photographs. She was a girl, a typical LDS daughter of pioneer stock. Some Swedish immigrants came to Utah, and she was born in Santaquin in 1868. So she did not come to Utah across the plains or anything like that. She was born here and raised. And so these women that we're talking about go from some early up to some more recent. But she was born, she was the youngest of 8 children. She had to live in a cabin with a dirt floor, and all the children had to help earn money. And their family was called to go to Snowflake, Arizona, and settle down there, which was very rural, not a lot to do there. They had to work hard to have a living. And she their family was very obedient. She grew up in a small LDS community, and she married her childhood sweetheart. So this is one of those stories, a good LDS girl marries a childhood sweetheart, and he was also a polygamist. And so she had several children, and because of the anti-polygamy laws, her husband couldn't be with both women, and he went to Utah, and she was down in Snowflake with several children that she now was left to support. And she had very little skills. She knew how to work in the garden and do all the things that it takes to keep house in those days. But someone walked into the store that she was working in and handed her a camera one day. And she took that camera. She had no formal training in photography, just a rural farm girl. And she took that camera and was fascinated and started taking pictures of the community of Snowflake. And in those days, I'm sure we've all got in our collections photographs of people sitting very still and not smiling and not blinking because of the camera and the equipment that we had in those days. We didn't have the fast action shutters and all of that. But she was able to capture, and when you look through some of her images, they are delightful. I've got one that I absolutely love of children in a barrel with the water just flowing over the sides of the barrel. And to capture that kind of motion and spontaneity in the lives of the members of Snowflake is amazing for that time period, because everything you had to hold so still. She has delightful images, and so the way she kept the record was through photographs. And we learn a lot about the life and times of people in Snowflake, Arizona through these photographs. And we've gone over and over and over them going, oh, look at this, and isn't this delightful? There's some happy pictures. There's people in a garden smiling and laughing, and you don't often see that in these early images. She really broke the traditional boundaries of photography for that time period.
Probably because she wasn't trained.
Exactly. So she was capturing what interests her. And there's some fun pictures of how she tried to set up backgrounds, and she'd hang a sheet up and have people posed in front of it, or sometimes a little hand pops out on the side. So there are some fun images of her that she did, and we've got quite a few images in our collections of hers. But it shows how a woman can take a difficult situation. I imagine trying to raise several children and with no skills and no right, it's hard enough to go get a job now for a lot of single women raising families, and I relate that to what single women's raising families have to do today. And she just figured out what to do and started a little photography business.
Do we have a record of who that person was that gave her the camera?
I haven't tracked that down yet. We have just a brief biographical sketch on her. We don't have a lot of information about her. We're learning more and more. We have her photographs, and that's what's really fun. That would be fun to learn that a little bit more. I may dig into that a little more and see what I can find. But I just know she was given a camera and did great things with it.
Any other recording that we have of Ellen and her life? Any
right?
Journals?
We do have an oral history, and we do have some poetry that she left, and so we've got a little bit more. And she also became an officiator in the temple, in the St. George Temple, for 13 years, and ultimately she and her husband reunited and were officiators in the St. George Temple. So it's a fun story to learn about how she went through all this, and then how she was reunited, and how she stayed faithful and true all of her years. The record she kept is really lives in her photographs.
Good. On to our last person, a very famous Mormon artist, Minerva Teichert. I've really enjoyed her work all my life. I went to the Manti Temple for the very first time, and one of my favorite is the World Room in the Manti Temple of her work. It is just amazing. So let's talk about Minerva.
Oh, she's a great woman as well. And all of these women, we could go on and on and on and on about their lives. So these are just some high-level things that we're talking about. And she was born in Ogden, and she was the second of 9 children, and again, a daughter of some pioneer immigrants. So this is moving along through the years, not early in the 1840s and 50s. We're in the 1880s. So she studied art in San Francisco and Chicago and New York. And
at a fairly early age.
Yes, she was young, and she loved the arts. She was passionate about her painting, and she absolutely loved it. And so her parents helped provide opportunities for some formal art training at 14. She was able to go off to studying in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and lots of well-known art schools. So she was excited and passionate about this. And so it was really, but her artwork was pretty obscure, pretty unknown. And but she still had a love of the art. And one of her art teachers realized that she was LDS and was Mormon, and she really hadn't done a lot with it. And she kept toying, what do I do? What do I do? Do I go raise a family? Do I go get married and raise a family? Or do I pursue my art degree? And she makes a comment that she promised the Lord that if she'd finished, she says, if I'd finished my work and he'd give me some more, I'd gladly do it. With his covenant in my heart, I began to live. So she was struggling through, what do I do with my life and what do I do with my art? She really dedicated herself basically to working with the Lord, if the Lord would help give her some work to do. So she felt that she had lots of angels come into and influence her life. She talks about realizing who she needed to go marry, sitting in a sacrament meeting, and someone getting up. And I thought, boy, this happens all the time, how women often get up in testimony meeting and they are bearing testimony of a sister speaking on how happy they are to be married, and how much they love their family and their husbands. And she was sitting in a sacrament meeting, and she heard a woman just get up and say that simple little phrase, and she said, I thought of all the men I had ever met in my search for getting gold. And then she realized at that moment that back on the Idaho desert, herding his cattle and branding his calves, was a man more nearly meant for me than anyone else in the world. So through one little statement in a testimony meeting, she felt she needed to go back and marry her sweetheart there on the cattle ranch, even though he was not a member of the church. So here we have a woman marrying a non-member who later converts to the church. But a simple statement in a sacrament meeting began one of her angelic. So you never know when you're going to touch the lives of other people.
Life wasn't easy on the ranch for Minerva.
It was not. In fact, they were very poor, and her artwork was not selling real well. She did some Western artwork as well as lots for the church.
And it actually got put on the back burner for quite a while. Is that right?
It did, because at that time the church really didn't pursue a lot of the artwork like we do today. But she had this quest that one of her instructors, while she was in school, basically told her that he asked her a question. He says, has anyone ever painted that great Mormon story of yours? He was not a member. And he says, has anybody painted that Mormon story? And she said, no, not that I know of. And he turned to her and said, good heavens, girl, what a chance. You do it. You're the one. That's your birthright. You feel it. You'll do it well. And which she commented, I felt that I had been commissioned. And so this is from just an art teacher saying, have you ever thought about documenting the history of the church through your painting? So she did take that upon herself and painted amazing. They're everywhere. We've got some of them in our museum. We've got some over in our church history library. We've got Minerva Teichert. You see them in lots of places. And so she struggled. And here's another. She not only received angels in her life that came along the way, but she became an angel for someone else. Once she met a young woman who was considered the ugly duckling of her family. And Minerva told her, this young girl that was the ugly duckling, why, you're one of the most beautiful girls I've ever seen. And she wanted to paint her. And that girl blossomed because someone recognized her beauty. I think what a marvelous story. So not only was she touched by angels, but she became an angel for someone else.
And as part of her struggles on the ranch, she said it was not only difficult, but a rather joyful life. She said, my greatest joy in living was having to get along under difficulties. What joy I took in building the window seat and play box in my own cabinets, yes, and making over my New York suits and dresses for the little boys' clothes. That's right. A great quote.
Oh, I think those are marvelous. So life wasn't easy. She again had her trials like everyone else, of poverty, of not being recognized until many, many years later, struggled, hardships, every one of these. But she wanted felt very compelled, and she did that great Book of Mormon art series. And she's got nearly 1,000 pieces of art scattered around where she's told the story. And you look at some of her paintings, and it just captures, when you understand some of the things and how she's painted, you understand the passion and for the church and for her religious upbringing.
So let's bring it all together here. You did this presentation highlighting these amazing lives of these four women. What are the lessons that we can learn?
The lessons that I think I get out of it are, number one, that we all have trials. All of these women went through some type of trial, and they're very analogous and very similar to the trials that we have today, just different times, different situations. And that the Lord is in charge, and if He has things that He wants to work through us, that we'll get there. And also we can be inspired by other people. Angels can come into our lives, and we are also never know when we are an angel for someone else. Like simple thing like bearing a testimony and where it may or may not touch someone else's life. So both will be inspired by others, as well as others inspiring us. And the Holy Ghost is the key in all of that, to bring it so that we can be in tune with the right inspiration that we receive. And also, as we record these trials and blessings, whether it be through whatever medium, that we can find strength. We hear, Emmeline pouring her heart out, but yet that gave her the desire and the will to keep going. We can build that strength and build our testimony and our faith as we record and go back and revisit and say, what did I learn from these experiences? And what did I do about those experiences that helped me go forward? And then I would say the last thing that we learn is there's just not one way to keep a record. We have photographs, we have paintings, whatever individuals have a passion for or a talent for, whatever talents they have. Some write well, other people hate to write. But there are different ways of recording and keeping a record. And I think that's important to know. When you put all the pieces together, like at Snowflake, Arizona, if we have journals, we have diaries, we have the written word, we have photographs, how much more full the story is when you have all the different medium, and you can tell it through different ways.
And in our time and age, with so many different electronic ways of recording things.
Exactly. So we're in a whole new era that we can learn how to keep a record. There's many, many ways to keep a record. I hope we don't lose it all through text messaging and emails. That we figure out a way to save and preserve the history that we're making, so that we can. In fact, Elder Eyring talks in October's conference of 2007. He even made this point. My point is to urge you to find ways to recognize and remember God's kindness. It will build our testimonies. You may not keep a journal, but you and they will be blessed as you remember what the Lord has done. And I'm thinking that means we keep a record and remember the good things that the Lord's done for our lives.
At the very end of your presentation, you quote the Doctrine and Covenants, which says, "All flesh is in my hands. Be still and know that I am God." To me, that is a rather comforting statement, knowing that regardless of what happens in our lives, what trials may exist, what may or may not happen for us, it's still going to be the way God wants it.
And that's one of my absolute favorite scriptures of all time. I've seen that in my own life. And we are surrounded by angels. We all have a role to play. There's something important for each one of us to contribute. And I think that's just so key and vital. And that scripture is what resonates with me, that is really a true statement, that there's a purpose for all of us. And it's important to remember and learn what that purpose is and remember and keep moving forward.
Very good. Thank you. There is a new series of books that's going to be published by the History Department. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we're really excited. Richard E. Turley, the Assistant Church Historian and Recorder, announced at the Mormon History Association in May that there's a Women of Faith in the Latter Days series, 7-volume series that's going to be coming out. And they're trying to do is pull together some of the Latter-day Saints' lives of faith and dedication, and a lot of them haven't received a lot of attention and that they deserve. So they're trying to make women more aware through some inspirational stories that point to how women live their lives. And so there's going to be a series that will contain 50 10-page chapters on different women from all walks of life. So each chapter, they're hoping to have maybe a photograph, some biographical information, and then their story. And so they're going from, for example, Volume 1 is going to be women born up to 1820. Volume 2, women born between 1821 and 45, all the way up through Volume 7, which is women born between 1946 and 1970. So they are inviting people that are interested in contributing to these volumes to submit a proposal. And we do have some of that information available if people are interested in
so
contributing.
So this is basically a call for entries.
It really is. It says we invite anyone interested in contributing to these volumes to submit a proposal or to lds.women.of.faith@gmail.com. And then they'll select some of the authors. But we know there's lots of great women's information out there, lots of stories that haven't been told. And I think this is going to be exciting. The first volume is scheduled for publication in 2011. So, and then they're hoping to do 1 year or a little bit more, or sooner, however it falls together. So it'll be a great contribution to the women's history in the church.
That sounds very exciting. Thank you. Once again, today we've been visiting with Christine Cox, Director of Library Services for the Church History Department, and discussing her presentation about these 4 remarkable women from pioneer times up to a little more recently, remembering and recording. Thank you, Christine, very much for being with us. Thank you. I'm Nathan Wright, host of Legacy, inviting you to listen to other programs on the Mormon Channel. The following is an excerpt from the program Everything Creative. Guest Joyce Erickson discusses the struggles and blessings she and her husband have experienced raising 6 children, 3 of which are severely handicapped. You can hear the entire episode as well as other Mormon Channel programs by logging on to radio.lds.org.
We have 6 children. 3 normal, healthy ones, Michelle and Laura and Heidi, and 3 others, Cindy, Heather, and Mark, who are severely handicapped. 2 of the 3 handicapped children, Heather and Cindy, have each passed away, Heather in 1989 and Cindy in 1995. None of the handicapped children were born that way, but each one began to manifest a disease called glutaric acidemia, somewhere between the 6th and 9th months of life. All of them were totally dependent on someone else for all of their needs because they were unable to do anything for themselves. They couldn't sit up, roll over, crawl, do anything with their hands, hold anything in their hands, swat a bug away, or do anything like that. And just to show you how much care it took, how much time it took to care for them, when all 3 of the handicapped children were alive, it took me about 7.5 hours every day just to feed them. Another thing you need to know is that Cindy and Heather had no speech, although Heather she did learn to communicate, and we learned to communicate with her, and Mark has some limited speech. And just as a little sidelight, I think it's kind of interesting that Mark much prefers the term handicapped to disabled, because he said when you say disabled, it makes it sound like you can't do anything. So that's why I use the word handicapped rather than disabled. So that's kind of the background of our family. And
well, I, of course, know you and know your family for many years, and I was so interested in being able to talk to you about them. As Elder Uchtdorf said, quoting him, "As you take the normal opportunities of your daily life and create something of beauty and helpfulness, you improve not only the world around you, but also the world within you." And to me, you're such an example of this, of being almost homebound for many, many decades, and yet still being able to have creativity in your life. I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about each one of your children. So can you tell me a little bit, something about Cindy?
Yeah, Cindy was the one who was the most involved, the most severely involved of our 3 handicapped children. Like Heather and Mark, she couldn't do anything for herself, but unlike Heather and Mark, we never found any way to really communicate with her. We could, she would, you could tell if she really liked something or if she really disliked something. But other than that, we really couldn't communicate very well with her. But you could tell that she could understand things that were going on around her, as she laughed appropriately when something funny happened. And she would watch, about the only thing she could do was watch other people play and and lay on the floor, laid on the floor all of the time. She watched TV. She liked to listen to music, and her very favorite movie was The Sound of Music, and she watched that over and over and over again. And she always hated the news, especially if they ever talked about any murder or anything violent of any kind. She did not like that. So, and people came over and helped us watch her while we would go out places, but it was really hard for her, and it was hard to take care of her too.
I remember, though, her with a big smile on her face most of the time.
She did have a smile on her face. When she was comfortable, she had a smile on her face. And, yeah, you're right about that.
Let's talk a little bit about Heather. I particularly love the story about, I think she was about 3 years old when you first learned that she could communicate. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, that's one of the funnest stories. I really like that story too. We just kind of assumed that because she was the second handicapped child that we had, that she was so much like Cindy that she would be like Cindy and that she wouldn't be able to communicate with us. And so one day I was sitting in the kitchen at the table feeding her, and I was holding her on my lap, and as I was feeding her, Michelle, our oldest one, who was in the living room, called in to me, and she said, "Mom, what time is it?" And when she said that, Heather turned her head and looked at the clock behind me on the wall. And I was flabbergasted. Number one, she knew to look at a clock when Michelle asked what time it was, and number two, that she actually turned and looked at the clock. And when I realized that, I looked at her, and then I said, "Heather, where's the stove?" And she looked right at the stove. "Where's the fridge?" And she looked at the fridge. "Where's the ceiling?" And she looked at the ceiling. "Where's the floor? Where's the window?" And
How
she knew
fun.
"Where's the toaster?" And she looked at everything. And I just couldn't even believe it. It was kind of like, well, and then I asked her, the interesting thing was I asked her, I wanted to know if she could answer yes or no. And so I said, "Do you like ice cream?" And when I asked her that, she just stared directly in my eyes, just stared at my eyes. And then I said to her, "Do you like bugs?" And she blinked her eyes and kind of shook her head just a little tiny bit. And so it was kind of one of those Helen Keller moments.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Just a beautiful epiphany.
It really was. And, what a blessing it was to her to be able to communicate, and what a blessing it was to us that she learned how to communicate. The interesting thing was, I just picked her up, and we didn't even finish feeding her right now. I picked her up, and we walked through all the rooms in the house, and I asked her where things were, and she knew where they all were. And this is amazing.
And so freeing and opening for her and your whole family.
Absolutely.
And as some of the things we'll talk about later, what great experiences she had and how well you knew her, even though she could not vocalize.
Absolutely. And how well she made everyone know her.
Tell us some of the things that you did with her that really helped her keep her mind active and that she was interested in.
Well, one of the things that I always thought was interesting was, I think it was every Saturday morning that she loved to watch this cooking show that was on TV. I think it was called The Frugal Gourmet or something like that. But, and the reason she indicated to us that she wanted to watch that TV show was so that she might learn to cook, so that someday she could cook for us. I just thought she was always always wanted to do something for someone else. That was just
very hopeful and yeah.
And knowing, here's a little child who can't do anything for herself, and yet she realizes that in the eternal scheme of things, someday she's going to be able to do all of the things that she can't do right now.
And so she gained that knowledge and enjoyed that.
She did.
Tell us about the time that I think it was Michelle came home from work or school, and Heather wanted her to make a pie for somebody in your neighborhood?
Yeah, she did. And Michelle went to the stove, and so she started making this pie. And Heather, she had to be right there in the kitchen, right on her beanbag, watching Michelle make this pie. And Michelle just had to stand there and stir it and stir it and stir it and stir it. And, Heather just kept looking at her like, thanks, Michelle, for doing this. And Michelle just kept wanting to say to her, well, Heather, I just wish you could do this. Heather said, well, I wish I could do this too.
Yeah. There was a time that I remember in Fast and Testimony meeting when you brought her up to the stand and you said, Heather wants to bear her testimony.
Oh my goodness, that was a scary thing for me.
Well, it was just so spiritual. And can you tell us about how that came about?
We're sitting there at the back of the chapel where we always sit, and Heather indicates to me that she wants to go up and bear her testimony. I'm holding her on my lap.
Tell us about how old she was.
She was probably about 7 or 8. Anyway, she indicated to me that she wanted to go bear her testimony. And I said, Heather, you want to go up there and bear your testimony? Yep. Opened her eyes really wide. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's what she wanted to do. So I kept trying to put her off, until I explained to her that she didn't really want to do that. Right. But she kept insisting, and so I finally decided, okay, I better find out what she wants to say. And so she indicated to me that what she wanted to say was that she knew that Heavenly Father loved her and that she was doing what Heavenly Father wanted her to do, and that she knew that someday she would be resurrected in a perfect body. And that's what she wanted me to say. And so I proceeded to carry her up to the front. By the way, Heather never weighed more than 38 pounds before she died. She died when she was almost 12. So that tells you how small she really was. So
why feeding was such an important part of their life.
Really, big time. And anyway, so when I carried her up to the front, she just had the biggest grin on her face. She was just grinning from ear to ear as I explained to everybody what it was she wanted to do and her testimony, essentially. It was, but the interesting thing was she actually had told me beforehand, 3 or 4 days before, that what she wanted to do, the very first thing she wanted to do after she died was that she wanted to ice skate. And so I told everybody that as I'm holding her up in front of the congregation. And when I said the first thing she wanted to do was ice skate, she looked at me with this no answer. And I'm saying, Heather, that's what you told me 2 or 3 days ago. And so that's what I told everybody else. But 3 or 4 afterwards, I said, well, what is it you want to do first if it isn't ice skate? And she said she wanted to walk first.
Oh, so it's a memory.
She had a personality that just never quit. One thing I wanted to just mention was that, because it kind of tells a little bit about her personality and Mark's too, is that one thing that they loved to do together was to pretend, and they could pretend anything. I would be the mouthpiece, and, they would tell me what they wanted to pretend to do. And so lots of times what they really liked to do was pretend to play cops and robbers. One of them would be a cop, one of them would be a robber, and seriously, one would rob a bank or a store or something, and they'd sit there and just pretend to no end. And then one of them usually the robber would get in the car, and the cop would get in a helicopter, and they'd fly to southern Utah and try to escape, and they'd take turns pretending, all kinds of different things.
And they were probably in beanbags.
Yeah.
And just, of course, Heather couldn't say anything, but it was, they knew how to communicate and knew each other, just best friends.
Yeah, they were. And as a matter of fact, all 3 of them, Cindy, Heather, and Mark, sometimes they would lay on the floor, and no sound, nothing, but they would lay on the floor, and it's like they would all blink at each other. And it was like they were communicating something. I don't know, but Mark says that they did. They communicated that way all the time. He could tell what they were thinking, and I just...
Of course, Mark is, we want to talk a little bit about Mark. As an experience that I've remembered a lot, and it was about a time when he was younger. I don't know how old he was. He was getting off the bus from school, and he was very sad. And you talked to him in just a very creative way that I'm sure was inspired by the Spirit.
It was inspired.
Yes. And it's such a great experience. Could you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, usually when he came home from school off of the special bus that has a lift on it for his wheelchair, usually he's very happy. He was very happy when he came home from school. And this particular time, I could tell as soon as they pushed him out of the bus and onto the wheelchair lift that he was about ready to cry. And so I hurried and got him in the house and took him out of his wheelchair and sat him on my lap and kind of held him close for a couple minutes, and he just let loose. And I let him cry for 2 or 3 minutes, and finally I said to him, "You really feel bad, don't you, Mark?" I said, "Did something bad happen at school today?" And he said, "Yeah." Then he said, "Mom, the boys at school are just so lucky." And I said, "Why do you think they're lucky, Mark?" And he said, "They can run and they can play football and they can run fast and run races." And then he started to cry all over again. And I just kind of held him close, trying to think of something to say. And so without really even knowing beforehand what I would say, I said, "Mark, you think the boys at school are really lucky, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, you know what, Mark? They are lucky. But do you know something? Everyone is lucky in some way. Did you know that?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, they are." And then without ever even thinking about it beforehand, it had never, ever occurred to me, I held up my left hand and I pointed to each finger and I said, "Mark, your friends are lucky," as I pointed to each finger. And I said, "Your friends are lucky because they can run and they can play football, they can ride bikes, play computer games, and write and draw," Mark said. I said, "Yeah, and draw. But do you know what, Mark?" I said, "You're lucky too." And then I held up my right hand and I said, as I pointed to each finger, "You're lucky because you got to go into the BYU locker room and meet all the BYU football players. And you got to go into the BYU locker room and meet the basketball players. And you got to sing with the Tabernacle Choir. And you got to meet Brother Otley, who was the leader of the Tabernacle Choir." And then Mark said, "And go on the USS Nimitz." And I said, "Yeah, and go on the USS Nimitz." And I said, "Do you know how else you're lucky, Mark?" And he said, "No." And I said, "You're lucky because everyone likes you." I said, "I don't know of anybody who doesn't like you." I said, "Did you know that one of your friends at school once said to me, 'Mark is so lucky. I wish I had as many friends as Mark has.'"
You have been listening to an excerpt from the Mormon Channel program, Everything Creative. You can hear the entire episode as well as other Mormon Channel programs by logging onto radio.lds.org. Thanks for listening.